Listen carefully, because what I'm about to say often makes those who prefer to live in complacency uncomfortable. Most people believe that the biggest threat to their financial future is inflation, a depressed stock market, or job insecurity. They're completely wrong. The biggest threat to their wealth and their ability to generate long-term compound interest is what they do every night between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. I've studied human behavior for 7 decades, and I've never met a truly successful person who hasn't first conquered what I call the night drain. This isn't some cheap motivational speech. It's a systems analysis of how human beings squander the most productive real estate asset they own, their own discretionary time. If this resource management problem isn't solved, any other financial strategy will be, at best, an exercise in efficiently organizing stagnation. There's a widespread tendency to complain about a lack of time while ignoring the most basic laws of arithmetic. The average professional works 8 to 10 hours, sleeps another 8, and is left with, conservatively speaking, 4 to 6 hours a day that are unconditionally theirs. This amounts to almost a second full work shift a week that owes nothing to any employer. The problem is that people often treat this time capital with a neglect they would never apply to a $100 bill lying on the sidewalk. Watching the 6th TV series of the week isn't rest. It's an extraordinarily expensive existential drift that prevents the development of any skills the market is willing to pay a premium for. Time, like money, accumulates. Investing 90 minutes each evening in developing a technical skill or a business model adds up to approximately 540 hours of personal development per year. Over a 5 to 10-year period, this accumulation of knowledge translates into an almost unfair competitive advantage over those who chose to binge-watch TV series. This is not a trivial matter, but rather one of the central levers of personal financial trajectory. Almost no one treats their evenings with the analytical rigor they deserve, and therefore most end up paying specialists for skills they themselves chose not to develop during their poorly managed leisure time. The first fundamental principle for reversing this situation is decoupling mood from action. It's a catastrophic cognitive error to wait until you feel motivated to start working after the workday. Feelings are lagging indicators, not drivers of action. Behavioral psychology is unequivocal. Action causes motivation, not the other way around. When you start a task, even with resistance and fatigue, the brain's reward circuit is activated and the resistance dissolves. The key is to lower the activation threshold by making commitments so small that they're impossible to refuse, like writing a single sentence or putting on your sneakers. Once you overcome that initial threshold, inertia starts working in your favor. Every time you take action despite fatigue, you're building behavioral evidence in your nervous system. This is concrete proof that you're the kind of person who gets the job done regardless of external circumstances. Over time, the gap between feeling and action narrows until the discipline becomes automatic. This transition to automaticity is one of the most valuable assets a human being can possess. Ceasing to negotiate with a tired brain, which is an unreliable negotiating partner and will always find excuses for procrastination, is the only way to ensure that your afternoon time yields real returns instead of evaporating on the couch. It's vital to understand that nightly self-indulgence is the failure tax that most people willingly pay. At the end of a tiring day, the brain seeks the path of least resistance, which is usually the passive consumption of irrelevant content. If this pattern isn't interrupted through conscious environmental design, life becomes a series of repetitions without progress. Wealth isn't built in moments of euphoria, but in the solitude of disciplined decisions made when one would rather be resting. Success is a byproduct of winning the battle against the impulse for instant gratification each night. For a disciplined investor, time management must be as rigorous as that of a high-yield asset portfolio. Failing to categorize each hour precisely allows chance and fatigue to determine one's financial fate. Structuring a successful afternoon is not a matter of luck, but rather a strategic allocation of cognitive resources. Any serious analyst distinguishes between maintenance, consumption, and reinvestment capital. Nighttime should be analyzed under this same lens to avoid systemic stagnation. Maintenance time includes tasks like cooking, cleaning, or managing bills. These are necessary, but in most cases, poorly optimized. Consumption time is legitimate leisure, essential to avoid burnout, provided it is allocated deliberately and not by default. Finally, reinvestment time is that dedicated to building skills, businesses, or intellectual property. The brutal diagnosis for many is that their maintenance tasks consume so much margin that there is nothing left for the future, and they don't even realize that it's a management failure, not a lack of actual time. The solution begins with the ruthless systematization of maintenance tasks. Preparing all your meals for the week on a Sunday afternoon can free up to 4 hours of fragmented, exhausting time each evening. Applied annually, this translates to shifting 200 hours of maintenance time into personal investment. Similarly, delegating low-value tasks, if the expected return on 1 hour of your own investment exceeds the cost of hiring help, is not an expense, but an investment with a direct 100% return. A sophisticated capital allocator understands that freeing up high-value cognitive hours by paying for low-value services is the smartest mathematical move they can make in their quest for autonomy. Human behavior is largely determined by the environment, an uncomfortable reality for those who blindly believe in the power of pure individual willpower. The sofa has a behavioral signature associated with passive consumption and the evaporation of intentions. Once one sits on it, a cascade of conditioned responses is activated that is difficult to break with mere willpower. The solution is not to have more discipline, but to change the architecture of the physical environment. Going directly from the office to a library or cafe before going home ensures that work is completed before the home environment triggers the relaxation signal. The physical separation of workspace and rest space automatically encodes this behavioral separation at a neurological level. It's important to recognize that not all hours possess the same intrinsic quality. Premium cognitive capital is typically found in the mornings, before the world begins to make constant demands on our attention. After a workday, the prefrontal cortex is fatigued, and drastically reducing the capacity for original thought and increasing vulnerability to distraction. Therefore, a rational allocation strategy diversifies development. The 30 to 60 minutes of peak morning alertness should be dedicated to the most demanding work, and evenings should be reserved for administrative or research tasks that require less mental effort. The entire burden of personal growth should not be placed on the hours when the brain is most exhausted. That is simply poor resource management. Ultimately, physical fitness isn't a lifestyle variable, but rather the operating system upon which all of an individual's cognitive performance runs. I've seen brilliant minds operate at a fraction of their potential due to chronic sleep deprivation or a sedentary lifestyle. Sleep deprivation reduces judgment and memory to levels comparable to legal intoxication. And worse, it clouds the ability to perceive that impairment in real time. The body is the only capital asset that cannot be replaced or covered by life insurance. Adhering to 7 to 9 hours of rest isn't an indulgence. It's the minimum viable condition for a high-functioning human being to execute any plan successfully with acceptable long-term returns. The architecture of your environment ultimately determines the trajectory of your results. Relying on willpower is a strategy for losers. Winners design systems where the right behavior is the path of least resistance. If your phone is the first thing you touch when you get home, you've allowed a persuasively engineered device to plunder your most valuable asset. Human behavior is largely a response to environmental cues, a reality most prefer to ignore in favor of the fantasy of total free will. If the space where they intend to work is the same one where they consume entertainment, their neurons will fire conflicting impulses that will drain their energy before they even begin. An environment saturated with distractions, like constant notifications or the television playing in the background, acts as an invisible tax on their processing capacity. To protect their mental capital, they must build a physically defined productivity sanctuary. Spatial separation isn't a decorative luxury. It's a behavioral engineering tool that allows the brain to enter a state of flow without the friction of constant temptation. The attention economy is designed to wage guerrilla warfare against your productivity. Every app in your pocket has been refined by thousands of engineers to hijack your dopamine system and keep you in a state of passive consumption. Understanding this is crucial to ceasing to be a victim. Your smartphone isn't a tool if it decides when you use it. Cognitive defense requires drastic measures, such as using timed device lock boxes or deleting social media during reinvestment hours. This isn't about being a Luddite, but about being a strategist who understands that you can't win a head-on battle against algorithms designed for addiction. Consider friction as your best ally or your worst enemy. If going to the gym requires searching for clothes, packing your bag, and finding your keys, friction is high. And the likelihood of failure increases with fatigue. On the other hand, if your equipment is ready by the door, inertia works in your favor. Apply this concept to your evenings. Prepare your workspace in the morning before leaving. Leave your book open to the correct page or your software loaded on the screen. By removing small initial obstacles, you reduce the activation energy needed to begin. Discipline is often simply the art of making what benefits us easiest to accomplish at our weakest moment. Cognitive loyalty also involves carefully selecting who you spend your leisure time with. The people you associate with act as a social environment that shapes your standards of excellence or mediocrity. If your social circle spends its evenings complaining or engaging in empty entertainment, you will end up mimicking those behaviors out of sheer evolutionary pressure. You can't build an empire surrounded by people who only think about the next instant gratification. Seek out environments, even if they are digital or literary, that challenge your intellect and elevate your aspirations. Productive solitude is infinitely superior to company that drains your ambition and mental clarity. Finally, they must learn to say no to external demands that colonize their reinvestment time. Being agreeable and available to everyone is a subtle form of financial self-sabotage. Every time they accept a social commitment out of obligation or respond to a trivial email after hours, they are surrendering a piece of their future in exchange for momentary social validation. Time is a zero-sum game. What they give to others, didn't they take away from building their own freedom? Protect their blocks of time with almost paranoid ferocity. Only when the world understands that their time is not for sale or available to the whims of others will they begin to accumulate the power necessary to truly own their destiny. To conclude this analysis, we must address the most common structural flaw: frantic activity without a clear compass. It's pointless to optimize every minute of the night if you don't know where you're rowing. Efficiency is doing things well, but effectiveness is doing the right things. Without a defined destination, compound interest has no fertile ground to take root. The greatest waste I've observed in 7 decades isn't laziness, but activism without direction. I know people who manage their evenings with surgical precision, read dozens of books, and attend seminars, yet 10 years later they're in exactly the same place financially and professionally. This happens because their effort is scattered. They jump from one idea to another without allowing any to build up. Time spent without a specific goal is simply a more sophisticated form of entertainment. For compound interest to work, investment must be maintained in the same direction over a prolonged period. Without a clear destination, they're just running on a treadmill, sweating profusely but getting nowhere. Defining what you're building is an intellectual exercise most people avoid because it requires brutal honesty. It's not enough to say, "I want to be rich," or "I want to be successful." Those are vague aspirations that don't dictate any concrete action on Tuesday at 8 p.m. You must identify a specific skill that the market values and that you can master through accumulating knowledge. Whether it's a real estate investment strategy, mastering a programming language, or creating a sales system, the goal must be so tangible that you can measure your progress every week. A blurry map only guarantees you'll get lost in the forest of daily distractions. The movement fallacy tricks the brain into believing that being busy is the same as making progress. Checking emails, organizing your desk, or reading economic news might create a feeling of productivity, but it's often just a form of structured procrastination. These are low-impact activities we choose to avoid the real, painful cognitive work required to build a new skill. True progress feels uncomfortable. It's the effort of solving a complex problem or memorizing a difficult concept. If your afternoon doesn't include at least one block of high-friction mental time, you're probably not building anything of lasting value. The concept of optionality is often misunderstood by ambitious young people who are afraid to commit to a single path. They believe that by keeping all doors open, they preserve their freedom, but in reality, they are guaranteeing their own mediocrity. By not choosing a direction, they never accumulate the critical mass necessary for success to become inevitable. True financial freedom comes from being so exceptionally good at something that the world has no choice but to pay you for it. That mastery is only achieved by closing doors and focusing all your energy into a single tunnel until you see the light at the other end. The successful polymath was first and foremost a disciplined specialist. Consider the opportunity cost of every decision you make after 6 p.m. Every hour spent on an activity that doesn't contribute to your ultimate goal is an hour you're stealing from your future freedom. This isn't a moral judgment, it's a practical reality. If your goal is to retire in 10 years, but your evening activities don't reflect that urgency, then your goal is simply a fantasy. Consistency between what you say you want and what you actually do when no one is watching is the only reliable indicator of your future success. Intellectual integrity means ceasing to lie to yourself about your true priorities. Compound interest doesn't just apply to money, but also to reputation and networking. What you build in your afternoons, a specialized blog, a coding portfolio, an investment thesis, becomes your invisible resume. In the knowledge economy, what you can demonstrate is worth infinitely more than a degree hanging on the wall. By producing something tangible with your free time, you're creating assets that work for you around the clock. These assets are what will eventually allow you to buy back your time and stop renting your brain to an employer for a monthly paycheck. The ability to resist boredom is one of the rarest competitive advantages in the modern world. We live in an age of instant gratification where the capacity to focus on a monotonous but necessary task has evaporated. Whoever manages to sit down each night to work on their goal, while the rest of the world chases the latest trend or their dopamine hit on social media, will ultimately win simply by wearing down the competition. Success is, to a large extent, a war of endurance against the temptation to become inconsistent. Spectacular results are almost always the product of years of ordinary work, executed with extraordinary consistency. They must learn to audit their results with the cold, hard knowledge of an external accountant. If, after 6 months of sleepless nights, they have nothing tangible to show for it, no new skills, no financial assets, no measurable progress, then their system has failed. Don't blame fatigue or circumstances. Look for the flaw in their execution process. Self-pity is a luxury that anyone striving for rationality cannot afford. Adjust your sales, change your environment, or simplify your objective, but don't continue executing a plan that isn't generating returns. The market doesn't reward effort, it rewards results that solve problems. Old age arrives much faster than the young imagine, and with it comes mental stiffness and diminishing energy. The time you possess now is capital that depreciates with each passing day. Wasting it is a form of arrogance, as if you assume you will always have the health and clarity to start anew tomorrow. Warren and I succeeded because we started early and never let the engine stall. The window of opportunity to build a solid wealth foundation is relatively narrow. Once it closes, the struggle for survival becomes much more bitter. Use your evenings while the fire of ambition still burns. I'll end with a reminder of the ultimate goal: total control over your time. We don't build empires to buy expensive toys, but to have the right to say no to anything that doesn't interest us. Success is being able to get up every morning and decide what to do with the next 16 hours without asking anyone's permission. That freedom is won in the darkness of ordinary nights, in the silence of rooms where study is chosen over leisure. You've been given the map and the system. Now the only question that remains is whether you have the character to execute it to the end. Luck has nothing to do with it. It's pure arithmetic and willpower.